In 218 BCE, a 29-year-old Carthaginian supreme commander named Hannibal Barca dragged tens of thousands of soldiers and 36 war elephants across the frozen summits of the Alps to strike the heart of the Roman Republic. Welcome to World Chronicles, where today we are breaking down the tactical nightmare of the Second Punic War and analyzing exactly how the Roman state survived the absolute brink of annihilation. This was not a mere border dispute over territory in the Mediterranean. It was an apocalyptic war of extermination between two superpowers. Rome possessed an inexhaustible pool of manpower and absolute naval supremacy, yet they were about to be systematically dismantled on their own soil by an isolated mercenary army completely cut off from its supply lines. The sheer impossibility of this invasion began in the biting, bone-chilling wind of the Alpine passes, where the brutal cold claimed the lives of nearly 60,000 men and animals before a single Roman blade was ever drawn. From the unprecedented meatgrinder at the Battle of Cannae to the desperate, grueling war of attrition that eventually led to the sands of Zama, this is the story of how surviving the ultimate catastrophe forged Rome into an unstoppable global empire. But before Hannibal could march on the gates of Rome, he had to prove to his starving, frostbitten survivors that the supposedly invincible Roman legion could actually bleed. To understand the cataclysm that was about to unfold, one must look backward to the bitter conclusion of the First Punic War. By 241 BCE, the Roman Republic had stripped Carthage of its vital maritime possessions, taking Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, crippling its naval supremacy, and imposing a crushing economic indemnity. But the Carthaginian state did not quietly accept a permanent secondary status. Under the command of Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, the Carthaginians pivoted their imperial ambitions westward into the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was a harsh land, rich in untapped silver veins and fierce indigenous tribes, providing Carthage with the exact resources needed to rebuild a massive mercenary army. The geopolitical reality was stark. Rome now controlled the Mediterranean Sea, meaning any future Carthaginian strike would require a secure overland route to the Italian peninsula. The inevitable collision point emerged at Saguntum, an independent Iberian city positioned south of the Ebro River. By previous treaty, the Ebro served as the recognized boundary between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. Yet, Rome had deliberately forged an alliance with Saguntum, effectively planting a hostile proxy deep within Hannibal's consolidated territory. In 219 BCE, having assumed supreme command, Hannibal recognized that Rome was using the city to project political power into his domain. He did not hesitate. Hannibal initiated a methodical siege of Saguntum, a calculated provocation designed to force the hand of the Roman Senate. For 8 agonizing months, the air around Saguntum was thick with the dust of collapsing masonry as Carthaginian siege engines battered the defenses, while the inhabitants waited for Roman legions that never arrived. The city finally fell, and its surviving population was systematically enslaved. Back in the capital, the Roman Senate reacted with characteristic political arrogance. Viewing Carthage as a defeated subordinate power, the Senate dispatched envoys to the Carthaginian government demanding Hannibal's immediate surrender. When the ultimatum was soundly rejected, the Roman Republic formally declared war. The serving consuls immediately drafted their strategies based on conventional military doctrine, dividing their regular troops to launch coordinated naval invasions into Spain and North Africa. They expected a swift, localized campaign contained safely away from the Italian homeland. But as the Roman war machine confidently mobilized for a foreign expedition, the Senate was completely blind to the geographical nightmare already moving relentlessly toward their northern border. In the late spring of 218 BE-CE, Hannibal marched out of New Carthage with a colossal force of approximately 90,000 infantry and cavalry. His immediate objective was to cross the Pyrenees and secure passage over the wide, turbulent Rhone River before the Roman command could intercept him. The logistics of moving such a massive, multinational mercenary army, complete with vast baggage trains and 36 African war elephants, across hostile tribal territories required an unprecedented level of operational control. Hannibal did not command a homogeneous national army. He commanded a volatile coalition of Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians held together solely by his personal magnetism, strict discipline, and the promise of Roman plunder. By the time the Carthaginian forces finally reached the towering foothills of the Alps in late autumn, preliminary battles and mass desertion had already thinned their ranks. But the true crucible was only just beginning. The ascent into the Alps defied all recognized military doctrine of the ancient world. Hannibal deliberately chose a treacherous northern route to bypass Roman coastal garrisons, driving his men directly into the tightening, unforgiving grip of early winter. The environment instantly became the primary enemy. The sheer verticality of the mountain passes, compounded by heavy snow, freezing rain, and unpredictable avalanches, completely shattered the army's fragile supply lines. Hostile Gallic mountain tribes launched relentless ambushes from the high ridges, rolling massive boulders into the narrow defiles and plunging the tightly packed Carthaginian infantry columns into sheer chaos. The psychological toll on the men was devastating, amplified by the sickening sound of pack animals losing their footing on slick frozen rock, their panicked shrieks fading as they vanished into the lightless ravines below. Yet, the supreme commander pressed forward without hesitation. Hannibal was making a brutal, cold-blooded mathematical calculation, entirely willing to sacrifice the vast majority of his expeditionary force to ensure that a hardened elite corps breached the Italian frontier. When the haggard remnants of the Carthaginian army finally descended into the Po Valley, the demographic cost of the crossing was staggering. From the massive initial deployment of 90,000 troops that had left Spain, only 26,000 starving survivors and a handful of emaciated elephants remained. Hannibal had systematically traded 2/3 of his military strength for the ultimate strategic advantage of absolute operational surprise. He had completely bypassed Rome's unassailable naval perimeter and deposited a hostile army directly behind the Republic's natural northern defenses. The sudden, impossible appearance of Carthaginian forces in northern Italy triggered a localized revolt among the subjugated Celtic tribes, who eagerly bolstered Hannibal's heavily depleted ranks with a vital influx of fresh manpower. The Roman Senate's grand strategic design of fighting a safely contained overseas war evaporated overnight. Panicked dispatches recalled the serving consuls from their planned invasions, forcing them into a desperate, uncoordinated scramble to redirect their legions northward. But as the Roman heavy infantry marched hastily toward the unfamiliar terrain of the Po Valley, they were completely unaware that they were walking directly into a masterclass of tactical deception. The first major collision occurred at the Trebia River in December of 218 BCE. The Roman forces, commanded by Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, were eager to crush the invaders and secure political glory before his administrative term expired. This ambition highlighted a fatal flaw in the Republic's military apparatus, where field armies were led by elected politicians whose tactical judgment was routinely compromised by the electoral calendar. Hannibal weaponized this impatience. He baited the Roman heavy infantry into wading across the freezing and chest-deep waters of the Trebia before they had eaten their morning rations. As the shivering, exhausted legions engaged the Carthaginian center, a concealed cavalry detachment, led by Hannibal's brother Mago, erupted from a hidden ravine to strike the Roman rear. The rigid Roman formation designed exclusively for forward momentum, collapsed under the multi-directional pressure, resulting in the eliminations of over 20,000 legionaries. Despite this catastrophe, the Republic rapidly raised fresh armies the following spring. In 217 BCE, Consul Gaius Flaminius, commanding an army of roughly 30,000 men, was tasked with blocking Hannibal's descent into central Italy. Flaminius was a populist politician desperate for a decisive field victory to cement his legacy. Understanding his adversary's psychological profile, Hannibal deliberately pillaged the wealthy Etruscan countryside, forcing Flaminius into a reckless, high-speed pursuit. The Carthaginian supreme commander was not merely outmaneuvering the Roman army, he was engineering the precise geographical coordinates of its destruction. He selected a narrow defile along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, bordered by steep, forested hills on one side and deep water on the other. Under the cover of darkness, Hannibal positioned his heavy infantry at the bottleneck to block the exit, while concealing his light infantry and cavalry along the elevated ridges running parallel to the shoreline. When the Roman vanguard entered the pass at dawn, a thick, unseasonable morning fog clung heavily to the surface of the lake, restricting visibility to mere feet and entirely hiding the slopes above. Because of the forced marching speed demanded by Flaminius, the Roman legionaries were stretched dangerously thin along the narrow shore, remaining in a marching column rather than deploying into a battle formation. When Hannibal finally gave the signal, the geographic trap snapped shut. Carthaginian forces surged down the hillsides, driving the Romans laterally into the water. This ambush structurally dismantled Roman tactical doctrine. Stripped of the physical space required to form a cohesive, interlocking defensive line, the renowned discipline of the legions became entirely useless against an enemy that exploited vertical terrain to strike the flanks and rear simultaneously. The tactical execution was flawless, and the resulting casualties were catastrophic. In less than 3 hours, an estimated 15,000 Roman soldiers were killed in action, thousands of them drowning under the immense weight of their own chainmail and armor as they were pushed backward into the depths of the lake. Consul Flaminius himself was killed in the chaos, leaving his leaderless army to be systematically erased. When a handful of exhausted, blood-soaked survivors finally stumbled into the capital days later, the news they carried paralyzed the government. As the absolute scale of the Trasimene disaster settled over the city, the Roman Senate was forced to recognize a terrifying new reality. Against an adversary who weaponized the terrain itself, conventional warfare was no longer a survivable option. To break this paralyzing deadlock, the Roman Senate resolved to overwhelm the Carthaginian invaders through sheer, undeniable mass. By the summer of 216 BCE, the Republic mobilized an unprecedented field army of approximately 80,000 infantry and cavalry. This colossal force was entrusted to the co-command of consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Their explicit mandate was to abandon evasive maneuvers and force a decisive pitched battle. They tracked Hannibal to a supply depot near the village of Cannae, located on the flat, sun-baked plains of Apulia. To the Roman commanders, the terrain appeared to neutralize all of Hannibal's proven advantages. There were no forested ridges to conceal ambushers, no freezing rivers to cross, and no deep defiles. It was an open, featureless expanse that perfectly suited the Republic's traditional doctrine of blunt, overwhelming frontal assault. Yet, and they failed to recognize that Hannibal had deliberately selected this exact grid of earth precisely because of its flat geometry. Consul Varro, who held the rotating command on the day of battle, deployed his legions with a singular, uncompromising objective to smash through the Carthaginian line using unstoppable forward momentum. He ordered the Roman maniples packed tighter and deeper than standard doctrine dictated, creating a massive, highly concentrated block of heavy infantry. Hannibal countered with a deployment that seemed suicidal to conventional military theorists. He arranged his frontline infantry into a convex crescent that bowed outward, directly toward the advancing Roman center. At the very apex of this bulge, Hannibal placed his most expendable and lightly armored troops, his Gallic and Iberian mercenaries. He anchored the extreme edges of this infantry line with his elite, battle-hardened African veterans who stood in deep, tightly disciplined columns. On the wings of the formation, he positioned his heavy and Numidian cavalry, tasked with engaging their Roman counterparts. When the Roman war machine finally advanced, the environment immediately conspired against them. The fierce Vulturnus wind swept across the Apulian plain, driving dense, blinding clouds of coarse dust directly into the eyes of the Roman legionaries. This grit severely restricted their peripheral vision and obscured the Carthaginian flanks. Blinded by the dust, the Roman heavy infantry crashed into the center of Hannibal's crescent with tremendous force. Exactly as the Carthaginian supreme commander had engineered, his center did not hold. The Gauls and Iberians slowly yielded ground, deliberately stepping backward and absorbing the colossal kinetic energy of the Roman push. The convex bulge flattened and then began to invert, forming a concave pocket. Convinced that the enemy line was buckling and victory was imminent, the Roman centurions aggressively pushed their men deeper into the yielding center. In doing so, they actively engineered their own doom. The physical mechanics of the Roman forward surge created a fatal bottleneck. As the tens of thousands of legionaries converged into the narrowing pocket, the lateral pressure became immense. Men were compressed so violently against one another that the strict intervals required for the use of the sword collapsed entirely. Legionaries found their arms pinned to their sides, and physically incapable of raising their shields or drawing their weapons. They were no longer a tactical unit. They were a paralyzed, immobilized mass of infantry, entirely stripped of the ability to defend themselves. At this precise moment, Hannibal triggered the final phase of the trap. The Carthaginian center ceased its retreat and locked shields. Simultaneously, the columns of elite African infantry stationed on the flanks pivoted inward, striking the Romans from both sides in a synchronized, crushing vice. The trap was definitively sealed when Hannibal's heavy cavalry, having successfully routed the Roman horsemen from the field, wheeled around and slammed into the rear of the Roman infantry block. The perfect double envelopment was complete. The psychological terror within the Roman ranks was absolute, and as the realization of their encirclement rippled inward through the compressed core. What followed was not a battle, but a clinical, systematic eradication. The Roman command structure evaporated instantly. Consul Paulus was fatally wounded early in the encirclement, leaving his field officers to die alongside the enlisted men without the capacity to issue a single effective order. For hours, the Carthaginian forces methodically worked their way inward from the perimeter, executing a mathematically precise slaughter against an enemy that could not fight back. By the time the butchery concluded, between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers had been killed in a single afternoon, marking it as the most devastating loss of life in the Republic's history. As dusk fell over the Apulian plain, the dense dust finally settled over miles of the dead, leaving a profound, uninterrupted silence in its wake. The Roman Republic was now utterly paralyzed, forced to confront a terrifying reality where its entire military apparatus had ceased to exist. When the scale of the slaughter at Cannae reached the capital, the initial reaction was absolute, paralyzing terror. The cry that Hannibal was at the gate swept through the city. The Republic had lost an entire generation of its political and military elite in a single afternoon, including nearly 80 senators who had fallen on the field. Yet, in the face of complete structural collapse, the Roman Senate did not fracture, it calcified. To prevent psychological contagion, the piercing wails of mourning women echoing through the streets were swiftly suppressed by senatorial decree. public mourning was strictly limited to 30 days. Either in the very utterance of the word peace was officially outlawed. Desperate to rebuild the annihilated legions, the government drastically lowered the conscription age and authorized the unprecedented arming of slaves and criminals, prioritizing raw demographic survival over traditional class distinctions. The psychological strain of repeated catastrophes ruptured the boundaries of traditional Roman religious practice. Convinced that the peace with the gods had been fatally severed, the state resorted to archaic and extreme rituals of appeasement. In the center of the city, within the Forum Boreum, priests ordered the burial alive of 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks in a sealed stone vault. This state-sanctioned human sacrifice was a chilling measure of Rome's desperation, a brutal psychological mechanism designed to unify a terrified populace by demonstrating that the Republic would cross any moral threshold to ensure its continued existence. While Rome braced for the final blow, Hannibal made a calculated, pragmatic operational choice. He did not march on the capital. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, famously condemned this restraint, reportedly stating that Hannibal knew how to gain a victory, but not how to use it. However, this criticism fundamentally misunderstood the logistical realities of ancient warfare. Hannibal's army, though tactically supreme in the open field, was exhausted, heavily depleted of its core veterans, and entirely lacking the heavy siege engines required to breach the massive entrenched fortifications of the Servian Wall. Marching on Rome meant committing an unsupported expeditionary force to a static, multi-year blockade deep in hostile territory, inviting the precise attrition he had so carefully avoided. He chose instead to systematically dismantle Rome's political alliances across southern Italy, successfully defecting major urban centers like Capua, intending to isolate the capital until it collapsed from economic starvation. Yet, Rome refused to yield. As the immediate shock subsided, the surviving senators recognized that their traditional doctrine of aggressive frontal assault was indistinguishable from suicide. To deny Hannibal the pitched battles he required to dismantle the Republic, Rome had to fundamentally alter its military DNA. They would have to abandon the defense of their own burning farmlands and adopt a deeply unpopular, humiliating new doctrine, one that required the Roman people to completely swallow their pride if they wished to survive another year. In the immediate aftermath of Cannae, the Roman Senate suspended the traditional dual consul command structure and resurrected an emergency office by appointing a dictator. They chose Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, a seasoned politician who understood that defeating Hannibal in open combat was a mathematical impossibility. Fabius recognized a fundamental truth about the Carthaginian expeditionary force. Hannibal's center of gravity was not his supply lines, which barely existed, but his aura of invincibility. To preserve the fragile alliances holding the Republic together, Hannibal needed spectacular, pitched battles to prove Rome was dying. Fabius instituted a radical, humiliating military doctrine designed to deny him exactly that. The Republic would no longer fight to win. It would fight exclusively to not lose. The Fabian Strategy was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare and grueling attrition. Fabius deployed his newly raised legions not to the plains, but to the elevated mountainous terrain where Hannibal's elite Numidian cavalry was rendered entirely ineffective. Instead of engaging the Carthaginian vanguard, Roman forces shadowed Hannibal's army like a parasite, maintaining a safe distance while systematically harassing extended foraging parties. Fabius ordered the rural populations to abandon their undefended villages, retreat behind the walls of fortified towns, and execute a ruthless scorched earth policy. By burning their own crops and slaughtering their own livestock before the enemy could seize them, the Romans forced the Carthaginian army to expend massive amounts of energy simply to secure its next meal. Implementing this strategy required an agonizing level of psychological discipline from the Roman military apparatus. For the average legionary and the deeply proud Senate, this evasive doctrine felt indistinguishable from cowardice. Political friction in the capital reached a boiling point as Fabius's own political enemies mockingly branded him cunctator, the delayer, accusing him of passively surrendering the Italian homeland to a foreign invader. Out in the field, Roman commanders had to physically restrain their furious heavy infantry, forcing them to stand rigidly in formation on the high ridges, while watching heavy columns of black smoke rise from their own ancestral farmlands, burning on the plains below. Fabius demanded absolute obedience, knowing that a single moment of wounded pride could trigger another Cannae. Yet, the brutal arithmetic of the Fabian strategy slowly began to work. An occupying army cannot sustain itself indefinitely without capturing primary logistical hubs or receiving steady reinforcements. Because Rome maintained absolute naval supremacy, Carthage could not easily resupply its greatest supreme commander by sea, leaving Hannibal to rely entirely on the finite resources he could extract from a hostile countryside. Hannibal was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. He could march wherever he pleased in Italy, but he could no longer dictate the terms of the war. His irreplaceable core of battle-hardened veterans aged, his resources dwindled, and his momentum bled out over a series of minor, indecisive skirmishes. However, Fabius Maximus knew that simply starving Hannibal in Italy would not end the Second Punic War. To permanently dismantle the Carthaginian war machine, Rome had to sever the economic artery funding the invasion, an artery that lay completely unguarded across the sea in the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula was not merely a territorial province, it was the financial engine of the Carthaginian Empire, producing the vast quantities of silver and mercenary manpower required to sustain operations in Italy. Recognizing this vulnerability, the Roman Senate took an unprecedented constitutional risk in 210 BCE. They granted supreme command of the Spanish theater to Publius Cornelius Scipio, a 24-year-old officer who technically lacked the prerequisite political age for such sweeping authority. Scipio was a survivor of the brutal encirclement at Cannae. Yet, unlike the older generation of Roman politicians who were paralyzed by the trauma of that afternoon, Scipio treated Cannae as a textbook. He objectively studied the mechanics of Hannibal's tactical fluidity, understanding that the traditional Roman doctrine of rigid forward-marching infantry blocks was fundamentally obsolete. Upon arriving in Spain, Scipio did not immediately engage the dispersed Carthaginian field armies. Instead, in 209 BCE, he launched a sudden, highly coordinated amphibious and land assault directly against Nova Carthago as the geopolitical and economic capital of Carthaginian Iberia. The operation relied on precise timing and geographic intelligence, exploiting a localized low tide in the city's lagoon to assault an undefended section of the wall. The strategic impact of this capture was immediate and devastating. By securing Nova Carthago, the Roman Republic seized an immense stockpile of military equipment, hostages used to ensure the loyalty of local Iberian tribes, and control over the vital regional silver mines. The flow of wealth that had funded Hannibal's Italian campaign was severed overnight, shifting the economic momentum of the war decisively into Roman hands. Scipio utilized these captured resources to systematically rebuild and modernize the Roman military machine. He fundamentally redesigned the tactical capabilities of the legion, and instead of a monolithic formation that could only push forward, Scipio drilled his maniples to operate as highly disciplined independent tactical units, capable of executing complex flanking maneuvers and retreating under pressure without breaking their defensive lines. He recognized that to defeat Hannibal, Roman forces needed to match Carthaginian flexibility on the battlefield. Furthermore, He equipped his heavy infantry with a devastating new weapon adopted from the local tribes, the gladius hispaniensis. This short, perfectly balanced Spanish sword was designed for lethal thrusting in tight formations, drastically increasing the close quarters lethality of the Roman legionary. The harsh metallic scrape of tens of thousands of these new blades being drawn during rigorous, relentless training sessions echoed across the Spanish camps, signaling a resurrected Roman war machine. Armed with this reformed military apparatus, Scipio systematically dismantled Carthaginian control over the peninsula. In a series of brilliant tactical engagements, culminating at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, he successfully executed a complex double envelopment against seasoned Carthaginian commanders, weaponizing the very maneuvers that had once destroyed Roman armies. Carthage's Iberian Empire completely collapsed, permanently cutting off Hannibal from his primary source of wealth and reinforcing manpower. Yet, amidst this sweeping strategic victory, one critical tactical failure occurred. Following an earlier engagement at the Battle of Baecula, Scipio was unable to completely trap the forces of Hannibal's brother, Hannibal Barca. Gathering the remnants of his veteran mercenaries and vast sums of silver, Hasdrubal abandoned Spain and marched north. He was now driving a massive relief army toward the freezing passes of the Alps, threatening to unleash a second invasion of Italy and recreate the apocalyptic nightmare of 218 BCE. In the spring of 207 BCE, Hasdrubal successfully navigated the Alpine passes, bringing a massive relief army of veteran mercenaries and fresh Gallic recruits into northern Italy. His immediate strategic objective was to unite with Hannibal in the south, a convergence that would have provided Carthage with enough combined military mass to finally lay siege to the city of Rome. However, the Republic secured a critical intelligence victory when Roman patrols intercepted Carthaginian messengers carrying Hasdrubal's precise march route. Consul Gaius Claudius Nero, currently stationed in the south shadowing Hannibal, immediately recognized the existential threat this junction posed. In a stunning violation of established political protocol and strict consular jurisdiction, Nero secretly detached 7,000 of his most elite infantry and cavalry, leaving the remainder of his army in camp to maintain the illusion of a full presence. Nero engineered a logistical miracle. He executed a grueling forced march of nearly 250 miles in a single week to secretly reinforce his co-commander, Consul Marcus Livius Salinator, near the Metaurus River. When Hasdrubal deployed his forces the following morning, the auditory intelligence of hearing two distinct consular trumpet calls sounding from the Roman camp revealed the devastating truth. He was facing a combined, overwhelming consular army. Attempting a desperate nighttime retreat, his local guides abandoned him, leaving the Carthaginian army hopelessly trapped against the swollen, unfordable banks of the Metaurus River. Forced into a pitched battle, the engagement quickly degenerated into a brutal, claustrophobic infantry grind, characterized by the immense crushing pressure of locked shields and the relentless forward surge of the Roman legions. As the Carthaginian center held stubbornly, Nero executed a brilliant tactical pivot. He pulled his troops from a stalled right wing, marched them rapidly behind the Roman lines, and struck Hasdrubal's exposed flank. Recognizing that his formation was irrevocably collapsing and the campaign was lost, Hasdrubal spurred his horse directly into the densest ranks of the Roman cohort, choosing to die in combat rather than face capture. While the destruction of the Carthaginian relief army was absolute, permanently severing the empire's capacity to reinforce its Italian operations, but the true decisive blow of the Metaurus was psychological. Nero swiftly marched his exhausted detachment back to the southern theater, returning to his original position before Hannibal even realized he had departed. Upon arriving, the Roman commander ordered Hasdrubal's severed head to be hurled directly into the Carthaginian camp. This act was not a display of mere barbarism. It was a calculated, definitive transmission of strategic defeat. When Hannibal looked upon the lifeless features of his brother, the Carthaginian supreme commander understood instantly that the immense sacrifices of the last 11 years had been rendered entirely meaningless. He quietly ordered his forces to retreat into the rugged southern toe of the peninsula, realizing the war in Italy was permanently lost, even as Scipio prepared to launch the final, lethal phase of the conflict. With Hasdrubal's relief, army annihilated, and the Carthaginian position in Spain definitively erased, the geopolitical momentum finally rested in Roman hands. Yet, the elder statesmen of the Roman Senate, led by an aging Fabius Maximus, remained deeply paralyzed by the enduring presence of Hannibal, confined in southern Italy. They demanded that all available consular armies concentrate on grinding the Carthaginian supreme commander into the Italian dust. Publius Cornelius Scipio, returning from his Iberian triumphs, vehemently argued against this deeply entrenched defensive mindset. He understood a fundamental principle of grand strategy. Defeating Hannibal on Italian soil achieved nothing but tactical vanity. As long as the city of Carthage remained untouched, the enemy war machine would never truly break. In 204 BCE, after overcoming intense senatorial resistance and political maneuvering, Scipio was granted authorization to launch a massive expeditionary force from the staging grounds of Sicily directly into the heart of North Africa. Upon landing, Scipio did not immediately hurl his legions against the massive, impenetrable fortifications of the Carthaginian capital. Instead, he systematically ravaged the wealthy agricultural estates of the African interior, deliberately applying the exact same economic strangulation to Carthage that Hannibal had inflicted upon Italy. Simultaneously, Scipio executed the most devastating diplomatic coup of the entire conflict. He capitalized on a violent dynastic dispute among the neighboring Numidian kingdoms to forge an ironclad alliance with the exiled Prince Massinissa. For 15 years, the elite, highly mobile Numidian cavalry had been the lethal backbone of Hannibal's victories, the precise instrument that had sealed the encirclement at Cannae. By turning Massinissa against the Carthaginian government, Scipio completely neutralized the enemy's supreme tactical advantage. The sudden rhythmic vibration of thousands of allied Numidian horsemen riding into the Roman encampment permanently shifted the theater's balance of power, transferring the ancient world's finest cavalry directly into the Republic's vanguard. The undeniable presence of hostile Roman legions operating with total impunity just outside their gates completely shattered the resolve of the Carthaginian Senate. Stripped of their Iberian silver revenues and facing the systematic destruction of their immediate agricultural heartland, the ruling government panicked. They issued the single directive that the Roman Republic had bled for over a decade to achieve, and Hannibal was officially recalled to defend the homeland. After 15 years of continuous, undefeated military occupation on the Italian peninsula, the supreme commander was compelled to abandon the very soil he had sacrificed tens of thousands of men to reach. He coldly ordered the slaughter of his remaining Italian pack animals to deny them to the pursuing Roman forces, boarded his hardened veteran corps onto a waiting transport fleet, and set sail across the Mediterranean. But as Hannibal's ships finally scraped against the sandy shores of North Africa, the geopolitical reality had entirely inverted. For the first time in his life, the ultimate invader was forced into the claustrophobic, desperate role of the defender. In the autumn of 202 BCE, the two greatest military architects of the ancient world finally converged on the dusty plains of Zama, approximately 80 miles southwest of Carthage. Before a single sword was drawn, Hannibal and Scipio agreed to a legendary, face-to-face parley between their respective encampments. The Carthaginian supreme commander, recognizing the severe demographic and tactical disadvantages his hastily assembled army faced, attempted to negotiate a peace settlement that would preserve Carthage's independence. Scipio, representing a Roman republic that had buried tens of thousands of its citizens to reach this precise moment, categorically refused. He offered only two uncompromising options. The first was absolute, unconditional surrender, and the second was a final battle to decide the hegemony of the Mediterranean. The diplomatic window closed immediately, and both generals returned to their lines to prepare for the culmination of 16 years of uninterrupted warfare. Hannibal structured his battle line around a vanguard of 80 war elephants, the largest concentration he had ever deployed, intending to use their massive kinetic energy to shatter the Roman heavy infantry blocks before the primary engagement began. To counter this, Scipio executed a brilliant engineering solution to a biological weapon. He deliberately abandoned the Republic's traditional interlocking checkerboard formation. Instead, Scipio aligned his maniples in strict parallel columns, creating wide, uninterrupted avenues running directly from the front of the Roman army to the rear. He temporarily masked these open lanes with lightly armed skirmishers to hide the structural trap. When the Carthaginian charge was ordered, the battlefield erupted with the deafening, terrifying blast of massed horns and trumpets designed to panic the Roman lines. But as the immense beasts accelerated toward the infantry, the skirmishers simply stepped aside. Deprived of a solid wall to smash against and pelted by javelins, the elephants instinctively surged down the path of least resistance. One, they ran harmlessly down the parallel avenues and exited the rear of the Roman formation, completely neutralizing Hannibal's opening gambit without breaking a single Roman shield. With the elephant charge rendered entirely ineffective, the momentum shifted instantly to the flanks. Scipio's cavalry wings, heavily augmented by Massinisa's elite Numidian horsemen, violently engaged their Carthaginian counterparts. The newly forged Roman-Numidian alliance possessed overwhelming numerical and qualitative superiority, quickly breaking the Carthaginian cavalry and chasing them entirely off the battlefield. This pursuit left Hannibal's infantry completely stripped of flank protection. Recognizing the danger, both commanders rapidly reorganized their front lines. Hannibal held his most lethal asset, his hardened and disciplined veterans from the Italian campaigns, in reserve at the rear, forcing the Romans to exhaust themselves fighting through two successive lines of mercenaries and citizen levies. When Scipio finally ordered his heavy infantry to engage this final veteran corps, the battle devolved into an exhausted, terrifying collision of the ancient world's most experienced forces. The sheer physical friction of thousands of bronze-rimmed shields locking together in a brutal static stalemate dictated the final hour of the war, as neither the Roman nor the Carthaginian veterans yielded a single inch of earth. The agonizing infantry deadlock was finally broken, not by forward momentum, but by the very tactical architecture that had nearly destroyed Rome a decade and a half prior. Having completely routed the Carthaginian horsemen, the Roman and Numidian cavalry reformed and rapidly galloped back onto the plains of Zama. They struck Hannibal's veteran infantry directly in the exposed rear. The irony was absolute and devastating. Hannibal Barca, the unmatched tactical genius who had orchestrated the annihilation of Roman armies through superior mobility, was now being systematically dismantled by a perfect double envelopment, the exact maneuver he had perfected on the bloody fields of Cannae. Unable to absorb the multi-directional pressure, the veteran Carthaginian center buckled, and the legendary army that had terrified the Republic for 16 years finally shattered. As the surviving Carthaginian soldiers broke formation and fled across the plains, the physical shield protecting their empire evaporated, leaving the great city of Carthage entirely at the mercy of the advancing Roman legions. The absolute defeat at Zama left the Carthaginian Senate with no leverage to negotiate. In 201 BCE, the Roman Republic dictated a peace treaty designed not merely to end the conflict, but to permanently dismantle Carthage's capacity to function as an independent empire. The terms were legally and economically devastating. Carthage was forced to surrender all of its remaining war elephants and was stripped of its legendary maritime power, permitted to retain a token navy of only 10 vessels to police pirates. Furthermore, Rome imposed a crushing financial indemnity of 10,000 silver talents to be paid over 50 years, effectively shackling the Carthaginian economy to the Roman treasury. Most paralyzing of all, while Carthage was legally forbidden from waging any war, even in self-defense against neighboring African kingdoms, without the explicit authorization of the Roman Senate. The physical city of Carthage was spared destruction, but its sovereignty was completely erased. Stripped of his military command, Hannibal Barca transitioned into the realm of civilian politics. Elected as a suffet, the highest executive magistrate in Carthage, he applied the same ruthless efficiency to state administration that he had once applied to the battlefield. He systematically targeted the corrupt Carthaginian oligarchy, reforming the judicial system and restructuring tax collection to ensure the state could pay the crippling Roman indemnity without excessively burdening the common citizens. On this sheer administrative competence proved that Hannibal was not just a warlord, but a brilliant statesman capable of resurrecting Carthaginian prosperity, even in peacetime. The rapid economic recovery of the city terrified the Roman Republic. The distinct, metallic clinking of Carthaginian silver arriving in Rome precisely on schedule served as a constant aggravating reminder that the architect of Cannae was still alive and highly effective. Despite the formal peace, the elder statesmen in Rome remained deeply traumatized. They understood that as long as Hannibal drew breath, the specter of a resurrected Carthaginian war machine would continue to haunt the Republic. Paranoia soon overpowered diplomatic agreements, claiming that Hannibal was secretly conspiring with Eastern Hellenistic kings to launch a new invasion. The Roman Senate dispatched envoys to Carthage with the unspoken mandate of engineering his arrest. Unable to sleep soundly while the Supreme Commander lived, Rome deployed its agents across the Mediterranean, initiating a relentless, multi-year manhunt to permanently extinguish the man who had brought them to the edge of extinction. Forced into exile to avoid Roman chains, Hannibal abandoned the city he had spent his entire life fighting to defend. He sought refuge in the courts of Eastern Hellenistic kings, first advising the Seleucid Empire and eventually fleeing to the remote kingdom of Bithynia in Asia Minor. Yet, the reach of the Roman Senate was absolute. In 183 BCE, Roman agents finally surrounded his unfortified villa in the village of Libissa. Stripped of his armies, his homeland, and any avenue of escape, the 64-year-old Supreme Commander chose the terms of his own death. He uncorked a small vial of poison he had kept hidden for years, supposedly declaring that he would relieve the Romans from the anxiety they had so long experienced, since they thought it tried their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. The bitter draught ended the life of the greatest tactical genius of antiquity, leaving him to die in lonely obscurity, far from the Mediterranean shores he once dominated. In the solemn reflection of history, Hannibal's ultimate failure was not military, but political. He possessed an unparalleled mastery of battlefield mechanics, but he fundamentally miscalculated the structural resilience of the Roman alliance system. Hannibal waged a traditional Hellenistic war, and operating under the assumption that a state suffering catastrophic military defeats would rationally sue for peace. The Roman Republic, however, did not behave rationally. It fought an absolute war of survival. The Senate and the Latin allies absorbed casualties that would have entirely shattered any other civilization on Earth, simply refusing to acknowledge defeat. Hannibal could destroy Roman armies, but he could not destroy the political machinery that relentlessly generated them. The legacy of this apocalyptic conflict permanently altered the trajectory of human history. The nightmare of the Second Punic War forced the Roman Republic into an irreversible evolution. To survive Hannibal, Rome had to discard its seasonal citizen militias and forge a continuously standing military infrastructure capable of projecting power across multiple continents simultaneously. The psychological trauma of Cannae instilled a ruthless, preemptive paranoia within the Roman political elite, driving them to conquer the known world simply to ensure no such threat could ever emerge again. Rome did not build its empire by never losing a battle. It conquered the Mediterranean because it learned how to endure the absolute brink of annihilation and keep marching forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the darkest hour of the Republic, and please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.